Ever feel like your brain is just completely scattered?
Yeah.
You know, like constantly jumping from one thing to the next. Like you're being pulled in a million different directions.
Yeah.
You're not alone.
Yeah.
Today,
Yeah.
we're diving deep into the Sirens Call by Chris Hayes
Okay.
to explore this whole phenomenon of what he calls the attention age.
Right.
It's not just a catchy phrase, though. It's like the reality we're all navigating these days.
Yeah, for sure.
And through these excerpts, we're going to unpack, you know, how we got here,
Yeah.
what it all means for us, and most importantly, what can we do about it?
Yeah, what's really fascinating is that Hayes doesn't approach this from like a purely technological standpoint.
Okay.
He frames the whole conversation through this lens of attention as like this fundamental aspect of being human, something that's always been with us, but it's being amplified now and in many ways kind of exploited by our modern world.
And he starts with this brilliant analogy. You know the classic story of Odysseus and the Sirens?
Yeah.
Odysseus had to physically tie himself to the mast of his ship.
Right.
To resist their deadly song.
Right, to resist that temptation.
Yeah. It's such a powerful metaphor for the constant battle we face, you know, to manage our focus in a world that's just overflowing with distractions.
It's like, yeah, they're these modern day sirens.
Yeah.
Just constantly vying for our attention.
That makes total sense. But I mean, there's so many different types of distractions, right?
Yeah.
So how does Hayes actually define attention?
Well, he breaks it down into three main categories. First, there's voluntary attention.
Okay.
And that's the focused effort we make when we're intentionally engaging with something, like reading a book or having a conversation.
Right.
Then there's involuntary attention.
Sure.
Those automatic responses to things like a sudden noise or a potential threat. You can think of it as our brain's built-in alarm system.
Like a fight or flight kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And finally, there's social attention,
right,
which taps into our deep-seated need to be seen, recognized, and connected to others.
That's the one that gets me, that social attention piece.
Yeah.
Because it explains why we can't resist checking our notifications, scrolling through social media, or, you know, getting caught up in the latest online drama.
Exactly. And to illustrate how potent this need for social attention is, Hayes shares this fascinating study where they found that some people would actually rather subject themselves to electric shocks than spend 15 minutes alone with their own thoughts.
Wow, that's intense.
Yeah.
I mean, it really highlights how much we crave that social stimulation.
Right.
Even if it's uncomfortable or even unpleasant at times. But how did we get to this point where attention itself has become such a valuable commodity?
Well, Hayes traces it back to a surprising source: industrialization.
Okay.
Before the Industrial Revolution, boredom wasn't really a thing. People were too busy simply surviving.
Okay.
But with the rise of factories and repetitive tasks, it created this whole new experience of tedium, this void that needed to be filled.
So that's where modern media was born.
Exactly. The rise of Hollywood and radio and eventually television. It wasn't just about entertainment. It was a direct response to this growing need for distraction from the monotony of modern life.
That's mind-blowing. This massive cultural shift tied to something as basic as boredom.
Right.
But here's where things get really interesting, because Hayes argues that just as labor became a commodity during the Industrial Revolution, attention has become the commodity of the information age.
Precisely. And he draws this really fascinating parallel. Just as industrialization standardized labor, digital platforms are standardizing our attention into these like bite-sized, monetizable units.
Oh, wow.
Every scroll, every click, every view, it's being packaged and sold.
So we're not just passively consuming content.
Right.
We're actually generating data.
Yeah.
That's being used to capture more of our attention and ultimately generate profit for someone else.
Right, exactly.
But is every 10 seconds of screen time really equal?
It's a good question.
Surely there's a difference between, say, mindlessly scrolling through TikTok and deeply engaging with a documentary you're passionate about.
You've hit on a crucial point.
Yeah.
Are we losing sight of those qualitative differences in our attention?
Yeah.
And this brings us to the concept of attention merchants.
Okay.
That's the term that HIT uses to describe these companies whose entire business model revolves around capturing and selling our attention.
So basically, anyone who's trying to get us to click, watch, or buy something is an attention merchant.
Exactly. And they've become incredibly sophisticated at exploiting our psychological vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
They use things like, clickbait headlines, endless notifications, algorithms designed to keep us hooked on this constant stream of content.
It's like that feeling of walking through a crowded city.
Right.
With billboards and ads screaming at you from every direction.
Yeah.
It can be completely overwhelming.
Hayes makes that very comparison.
Oh, does he?
Yeah. He talks about how in the 19th century, posters were plastered all over Paris, vying for people's attention.
Interesting.
It was a form of pre-internet spam.
Right.
And today we're just drowning in a sea of digital clutter.
Yeah.
From junk mail to clickbait headlines to social media posts that trigger our anxieties and insecurities.
Yeah, it's not just annoying, it's exhausting.
It is.
And I imagine it has to be shaping how we think and behave.
Absolutely. Hayes argues that this constant barrage of information and stimulation is eroding our ability to focus, think critically, and engage in meaningful dialogue.
Which brings us to this idea of the decline of debate in the attention age.
Yeah.
Hayes contrasts those famous Lincoln-Douglas debates.
Right.
Those legendary battles of ideas. That demanded sustained attention and deep engagement with today's political landscape.
Right.
Which often feels more like a reality show.
Exactly.
Than like a serious discussion of issues.
It's a stark contrast. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were all about persuasion.
Yeah.
Through well-reasoned arguments.
Yeah.
But in the attention age, the focus has shifted to grabbing attention.
Right.
Often through outrage, spectacle, and emotional appeals.
Would you say someone like Donald Trump was like a master of that?
Yeah, his strategy of using outrage and spectacle to dominate the news cycle, even if it alienated many, is a prime example of how the attention game is played in today's media environment.
Right.
He might not have always persuaded people, but you couldn't ignore him.
That's such an interesting point. It makes you think about the responsibility of the media in all of this.
Yeah. It's a complex issue, but one that Hayes explores in depth.
Okay.
He argues that the media, especially news outlets, have become increasingly reliant on attention-grabbing tactics to compete in this crowded landscape.
Yeah.
And that often comes at the expense of nuance, context, and thoughtful analysis.
So it's not just about individual choices.
Right.
The very systems we're operating within are designed to prioritize attention over substance.
Exactly.
And that helps explain why the news often feels so negative and chaotic.
Yeah.
It's a race to grab our attention.
Right.
Even if it's with something shocking or divisive.
Exactly. And the more we reward those attention-grabbing tactics, the more we see of them.
Oh, this is all starting to feel a little bleak.
Yeah.
Is there any hope for us in this attention age?
There is. And that's where Hayes' concept of enshittification comes in.
Enshittification.
Okay. Imagine your favorite website or social media platform. Now imagine it's slowly filling up with ads, clickbait, and low-quality content. That's enshittification in action.
Ugh.
Yeah.
I can definitely relate to that. It's that feeling you get when you realize you're actually feeling worse after spending time online.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is why Hayes explores ways to reclaim our attention, to push back against this overwhelming tide of information and distraction.
Okay, so what are some of those solutions?
Well, for one, he points to some interesting trends that suggest a growing desire for alternatives to this hyper-connected world. Think about the resurgence of vinyl records, the persistence of physical bookstores, and even the growing interest in so-called dumb phones, those simpler devices that are designed for calls and texts, not endless scrolling.
Yeah, it's like a counter movement, a pushback against the attention economy.
Yeah.
People are starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, there's more to life than being plugged in 204/7.
And it goes beyond individual choices. Hayes also challenges us to think about the role of platforms and the need for spaces that are free from this relentless pressure of monetizing our attention.
You mentioned that earlier, and I'm really curious to hear more. It feels like these big tech companies have so much power.
Right.
How do we even begin to create those kinds of spaces?
Hayes takes us back to the early days of the internet.
Okay.
Before the rise of these giant platforms.
Okay.
It was a much more decentralized, non-commercial space.
Okay.
People were connecting, sharing, and building communities without the constant pressure of clicks, likes, an algorithm.
It sounds almost utopian.
There was a sense of freedom, of experimentation. Yeah. It was a genuinely open frontier. And Hayes argues that we need to recapture some of that spirit. We need to support and invest in alternative platforms and technologies that prioritize user privacy, genuine connection, and meaningful engagement over profit.
Like Signal.
Exactly.
The privacy-focused messaging app.
Yeah.
I know you use that one.
Yeah, Hayes actually highlights Signal as a great example of a platform that's built on a different set of values. They're not focused on growth hacking or those manipulative tactics we talked about earlier. They prioritize their users' privacy and resist the temptation to exploit our attention for financial gain. It's a reminder that there are other ways to build and engage with technology.
It gives me hope that things can be different. But it's hard to imagine real change happening when these giant platforms have so much influence.
I know what you mean. It feels like an uphill battle. But Hayes offers a thought-provoking challenge, a way to reframe the entire conversation. He asks us to imagine a world where we apply the principles of labor law to attention.
Wait, what does that mean?
What if we had regulations that protected our attention, just like we have laws that protect workers from exploitation?
Whoa, that's a radical idea. But I love it. It makes you realize just how valuable our attention is. It's a resource, and maybe it's time we start treating it as such.
Exactly. Hayes acknowledges that it's a complex issue, and there would be challenges to overcome. But he urges us to at least start the conversation, to consider the possibility that we might need to set limits on how our attention is captured and commodified.
It's like we're at a crossroads.
Yeah.
We can continue down this path of ever-increasing distraction, or we can start to imagine and build a different kind of future, one where our attention is valued and protected, not exploited.
And that brings us to Hayes's final point, which I find both challenging and inspiring.
What's that?
He reminds us that we're not powerless in this attention age.
Right.
We have the power to shape it, to reclaim our minds, and to create a world where technology serves us, not the other way around.
Okay, I'm ready for that challenge. But how do we actually do that? Where do we even begin?
Hayes suggests we start with a simple but profound question. So, picking up where we left off, it's encouraging that Hayes doesn't just, diagnose the problem.
Right.
He offers some potential solutions, ways that we can push back against this attention-grabbing machine.
That's what I was hoping for, because honestly, just understanding the problem isn't enough.
Right.
Like, what can we actually do to reclaim our attention and feel less scattered?
One intriguing idea Hayes explores is this concept of commitment devices.
Commitment devices. Okay, what are those?
So think of them as strategies that help us stick to our intentions, even when we're faced with temptation. Like, let's say you want to spend less time on social media.
Yeah.
So you delete those apps from your phone.
Right.
That's a commitment device.
Okay.
It creates a little friction, making it harder to mindlessly scroll.
Yeah, I get it. It's like putting your alarm clock across the room.
Exactly.
So you have to physically get out of bed to turn it off.
You're making it harder to give in to that initial impulse.
Right.
And Hayes argues that we can apply the same principle to managing our attention.
Okay.
We need to find ways to create structures and systems that help us prioritize what matters most.
Right.
Even when all those shiny distractions are calling our name.
So it's less about willpower and more about setting ourselves up for success.
Exactly.
I like that. It feels more sustainable than just trying to white-knuckle it all the time.
Right.
But what are some real-world examples of these attention commitment devices?
Hayes draws this fascinating comparison between the way we consume entertainment now and how we used to do it back in the days of video store.
Oh, yeah.
Remember those?
I do, vaguely.
You'd spend hours browsing the aisles, trying to find the perfect movie for a Friday night.
It was an event.
And Hayes points out that there was this built-in commitment device in that process.
I see.
You had to physically go to the store, browse through a limited selection, make a deliberate choice, and then you were committed to watching that movie.
Yeah.
It wasn't like today where we have endless options at our fingertips.
Right, just one click away.
And we can switch between shows and videos with a single click.
I see what you mean. There was a sense of intentionality back then that's often missing in this age of instant streaming. You picked a movie, you committed to it, you experienced it.
And the shift to instant on-demand entertainment It's fundamentally changed our relationship with attention.
Oh.
It's become more fragmented, more fleeting.
Okay.
We're constantly grazing, sampling, moving on to the next thing without fully engaging with anything.
So is Hayes suggesting we all need to go back to using VHS tapes?
Not necessarily, but he does point to some intriguing trends that suggest a growing desire for alternatives.
Okay.
Things like the resurgence of vinyl records, the persistence of physical bookstores, and the increasing interest in, dumb phones, those simpler devices that are designed for calls and texts.
Yeah.
Not endless scrolling.
It's interesting, right? Yeah. There's this counter movement, this pushback against the attention economy.
Right.
People are rediscovering the value of slowing down, disconnecting, and engaging more deeply with the things that matter to them.
And it goes beyond individual choices. Hayes also challenges us to think about the role of platforms.
Okay.
And the need for spaces that are free from this relentless pressure of monetizing our attention.
You mentioned that earlier, and I'm really curious to hear more about that. It feels like these big tech companies have so much power.
Right.
How do we even begin to create those kinds of spaces?
Hayes takes us back to the early days of the internet.
Okay.
Before the rise of these giant platforms.
Right.
It was a much more decentralized, non-commercial space.
Okay.
People were connecting, sharing, building communities without the constant pressure of clicks, likes, and algorithms.
It sounds almost utopian.
There was a sense of freedom, of experimentation. It was a genuinely open frontier. And Hayes argues that we need to recapture some of that spirit. We need to support and invest in alternative platforms and technologies. Okay.
That prioritize user privacy.
Right.
Genuine connection and meaningful engagement over profit.
Like Signal, the privacy-focused messaging app.
Exactly.
I know you use that.
Yeah, Hayes highlights Signal as a great example of a platform that's built on a different set of values. They're not focused on growth hacking.
Right.
Or those manipulative tactics we talked about earlier. They prioritize their users' privacy.
Right.
And resist the temptation to exploit our attention for financial gain. It's a reminder that there are other ways to build and engage with technology.
It gives me hope that things can be different, but it's hard to imagine real change happening when these giant platforms have so much influence.
I know what you mean. It feels like an uphill battle. But Hayes offers this thought-provoking challenge.
Okay.
A way to reframe this whole entire conversation.
Okay.
He asks us to imagine a world where we apply the principles of labor law to attention.
Wait, what does that mean?
Like, what if we had regulations that protected our attention?
Yeah. Just like we have laws that protect workers from exploitation.
Whoa. That's a radical idea. But I love it because it makes you realize just how valuable our attention is.
Right.
It's a resource.
Yes.
And maybe it's time we start treating it as such.
Exactly. And Hayes acknowledges that it's a complex issue.
Sure.
There would be challenges to overcome. But he urges us to at least start the conversation, to consider the possibility that we might need to set limits on how our attention is captured and commodified.
It's like we're at a crossroads. We can continue down this path of ever-increasing distraction, or we can start to imagine and build a different kind of future, one where our attention is valued and protected, not exploited.
And that brings us to Hayes's final point, which I find both challenging and inspiring.
Okay, what's that?
He reminds us that we're not powerless in this attention age.
Okay.
We have the power to shape it, to reclaim our minds, and to create a world where technology serves us, not the other way around.
Okay, I'm ready for that challenge. But how do we actually do that? Where do we even begin?
Hayes suggests we start with a simple but profound question.
Okay, that's quite the cliffhanger. You mentioned the final point from Hayes, something both challenging and inspiring. I'm ready to hear it. What is it?
He leaves us with this, simple but incredibly profound question.
Okay.
If you could control your attention completely, what would you choose to focus on?
Wow. That really does stop you in your tracks.
Right.
It seems so straightforward, but it really gets to the heart of everything we've been discussing.
It does, because it forces us to confront our own values and priorities and habits. It's an invitation to just step back from that constant noise and ask ourselves, what truly matters to me? What do I want to give my attention to?
It's like a personal call to action in the midst of this larger societal conversation about the attention economy.
Okay.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
From the ancient allure of the sirens to the modern-day attention merchants. And it's clear that our attention is constantly being pulled in a million different directions.
What's been so insightful for me throughout this deep dive is how Hayes weaves together these seemingly disparate threads from, the history of spam to the rise of social media to create this comprehensive picture of the attention age.
It's not just about technology, right?
No.
It's about how technology interacts with our deepest human needs and desires.
Right.
Our craving for connection, our fear of boredom, our vulnerability to manipulation.
And within that intersection lies both the problem and the potential solutions. Because at the end of the day, it's our attention that shapes our experience of the world.
Yeah.
It's the currency of our lives.
If we're going to reclaim our minds in this attention age, we need to recognize the value of our attention, to see it as this precious resource, not something to be squandered or given away freely.
Absolutely. That means making conscious choices about where we direct our focus, what we allow to occupy our minds, and how we engage with the technologies that are constantly vying for our attention.
It's about becoming more intentional about what we consume, more discerning about the information we let in, and more aware of the subtle ways in which our attention is being manipulated.
And it goes beyond our individual choices. Hayes also reminds us that we have this collective responsibility to create a world where attention is valued and protected, not exploited.
What would that look like? What can we do collectively to create that kind of world?
Well, it starts with supporting businesses and organizations that align with our values. Those that prioritize ethical practices over quick profits. And it means advocating for regulations that promote a healthier digital ecosystem, one that prioritizes well-being over engagement metrics.
So we're not just passive consumers. We can demand better from the platforms we use, the companies we support, and the policymakers who shape the rules of the game.
Exactly. It's about shifting the balance of power from the attention merchants back to the people. And ultimately, that starts with each of us taking ownership of our attention.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I have this whole new perspective on how I spend my time and energy. And I especially love that question Hayes poses at the end. It's something I'll be reflecting on for quite a while.
Me too. It's a question that stays with you. And in many ways, I think the answer reveals the path to reclaiming our minds in this attention age.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, our listener, with that same question. If you could control your attention completely, what would you choose to focus on? What matters most to you?
Such a good question.
Take some time to really sit with that question.
Because
the answer might just reveal the path to a richer, more fulfilling life. One where you're in the driver's seat, guiding your attention toward the things that truly matter.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.